The room was silent, not the silence of peace, but the silence of witnesses who had just felt something crack open inside them. The Pope stood at the edge of a narrow bed, his white cassock slightly wrinkled from hours of walking through cold corridors, and he was weeping, not quietly, not with the controlled dignity of ceremony. He wept the way a man weeps when he has finally seen something he can no longer pretend does not exist. What he said next, through tears, in barely more than a whisper, would be repeated in headlines across 20 countries before morning. Before continuing with the story, please take just a moment to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Stories like this one only reach people like you because of your support, and it means everything. Now let's go back to what happened. It was the first day of March 2026, and the Vatican was already humming with the particular kind of controlled tension that had become its normal rhythm under Pope Leo XIV. Less than 10 months had passed since the white smoke rose above the Sistine Chapel on the afternoon of May 8, 2025, announcing to a stunned world that the Church had chosen its first American Pope, a 69-year-old Augustinian friar from Chicago named Robert Francis Prevost, who had spent the better part of his adult life in the dust and heat of northern Peru, learning, as he once put it, that the gospel smells like sweat before it smells like incense. Those months had not been quiet. Nothing about Leo XIV was quiet, even when he spoke in a low voice. Since his election, he had reorganized 2 major Vatican dicasteries, dismissed a Monsignor whose financial irregularities had been overlooked for a decade, and issued a public directive insisting that no Vatican office should spend more on interior renovations in a single year than it distributed in charitable aid. The old guard had bristled. The press had watched hungrily. The faithful, particularly those at the edges of the church, the poor, the forgotten, the immigrants, the sick, had begun cautiously to believe again. But none of that prepared anyone for what happened on the morning of March 1st. It began, as many of Leo's most consequential decisions did, without announcement, without a press release, and without the knowledge of anyone in his immediate administrative circle, except his personal secretary, Father Andres Valdivia, a quiet Peruvian priest who had served him since Chiclayo, and who had learned long ago that when the Pope asked for a car at 6 o'clock in the morning, the correct response was simply to arrange one. The destination was a place called Casa Santangelo, a residential care facility for elderly clergy operated under the authority of the Vatican, located on a narrow road outside the Leonine walls, about 20 minutes from St. Peter's Square. On paper, it was one of the church's most dignified institutions, a home for retired priests, aging nuns, and a handful of elderly lay members who had devoted their lives to Vatican service. It had been in operation for decades. It received annual funding from the Holy See's administrative budget. It appeared in every report that crossed the dicastery for clergy's desk to be functioning correctly. 3 weeks earlier, the Pope had received a letter, not an official memo, not a formal complaint, filed through canonical channels, but a letter handwritten in cramped yet careful Italian from an 84-year-old woman named Sister Josefina, a Franciscan nun who had served the church for over 60 years, the last 4 of them as a resident of Casa Santangelo. She had addressed it directly to the Pope with no certainty it would ever reach him. She had not written to complain. She had written, as she explained in the first line, because she was afraid that if she did not, she would die without having told the truth to someone who might still be able to do something about it. Father Valdivia had found the letter in the 3rd week of February, buried in a stack of correspondence that had been pre-sorted by the papal household staff. He had read it at midnight. He had placed it on the Pope's desk the next morning without a word of introduction. Leo had read it over breakfast and had not spoken for a long time afterward. Sister Josefina wrote about cold hallways, about meals served at 4 in the afternoon that were lukewarm by the time they arrived, about a staff that was understaffed and undertrained, who did their best but who were stretched far beyond what any human being could manage with care. She wrote about fellow residents, priests who had given their entire lives to parish ministry, who now spent their days in rooms with broken heating, waiting for medication that sometimes arrived late and sometimes did not arrive at all. She wrote about a man she called Father Marco, an 88-year-old former missionary who sat each morning in the corridor in his wheelchair, dressed, rosary in his hands, ready for a mass that was only celebrated twice a week, because there was no one to celebrate it more often. She wrote, "Holy Father, they are not asking for luxury. They are asking not to be forgotten, and I fear that we have been." Leo had read the letter 3 times. On the 3rd reading, he had made a small mark in the margin with a pencil, a habit from his years as a canon law professor in Trujillo, where he had annotated texts the way a surgeon marks a body before operating. The mark was a single vertical line beside Sister Josefina's final sentence. He had said nothing to the Secretary of State, nothing to the prefect of the dicastery for clergy, nothing to the communications office. He had asked Father Valdivia to arrange a car for 6 o'clock in the morning on the 1st of March and to ensure that no visit was logged in the official schedule. The car arrived in the early grey of morning. Rome in March still carries winter's breath in its stones, and the streets near the Vatican were nearly empty at that hour. A few delivery trucks, a street sweeper moving mechanically along the cobblestones, a pair of carabinieri who recognised the papal vehicle and straightened instinctively as it passed. Leo sat in the back seat in his white cassock, holding his breviary, though he was not reading it. Father Valdivia watched the Pope from the corner of his eye and knew better than to speak. Casa Santangelo appeared as they turned down the narrow road, a long pale building with iron balconies and tall shuttered windows, surrounded by a garden that in summer was probably pleasant, but in the first grey of March looked bare and slightly forlorn. The main gate was unlocked but unattended. There was no intercom response for nearly 2 minutes after Father Valdivia pressed the button. When the gate finally buzzed open, no one had come out to receive them. They walked in unannounced. The entrance hall was clean but cold. The floor tiles were old and well scrubbed, and there was a plaster statue of Our Lady near the door with a votive candle that had burned down to nothing and had not been replaced. A young woman in a nurse's uniform appeared from a side corridor, stopped abruptly when she saw the white cassock and went pale. She was perhaps 25 years old and looked as though she had been working for a long time already. "Holy Father," she managed. We weren't told." "I know," Leo said. He said it without any weight of reproach. "I'd like to walk. You don't need to call anyone." She walked with them anyway, partly because she was too stunned not to, partly because she seemed genuinely unsure what else to do. She told them her name was Eleanor. She had been working at Casa Santangelo for 14 months. She was one of 3 nurses covering the morning shift for 63 residents. 3 nurses, 63 residents. The Pope did not comment. He listened and walked. The first corridor they entered was the long one Sister Josefina had described. It was narrow and institutional, with pale green walls and fluorescent lighting that gave everything a slightly bloodless quality. Several doors were open. In one room, an elderly priest sat in a chair by the window, dressed but unshaven, staring at nothing visible in the garden below. In another, a woman in her 90s lay in bed with her eyes closed and a rosary on the pillow beside her, her lips moving slightly. In a third room, a priest appeared to be sleeping, though it was past 7 in the morning and there was an untouched dinner tray on the table beside him, leftovers from the night before, still covered in plastic wrap. Leo stopped at that door. He looked at the tray. He looked at the priest. He said nothing for a long moment. Elena made a small, miserable sound and said that the night staff had been short 2 people because of illness, and that sometimes the dinner trays— "What is his name?" the Pope asked. "Father Lorenzo. He is 91. He was a missionary, Congo, I think, for 30 years. Leo moved quietly into the room. He placed his hand lightly on the old priest's arm. Father Lorenzo opened his eyes slowly, blinking against the light, and looked up at the face above him with the mild confusion of the very old and very tired. Then his expression shifted, not into recognition of who this was, but into something simpler and more fundamental, the recognition of being seen, of having someone look directly at him. "Buongiorno, Padre," Leo said softly. "Buongiorno," Father Lorenzo said in a voice that was thin and very old. "Are you the doctor?" "No," Leo said. "I'm just visiting." Father Lorenzo nodded with the dignity of a man who had learned not to expect explanations. "Good," he said. "It is good to have visitors." Leo stayed a few more moments, spoke a few quiet words, and made sure the old priest had water within reach. Then he stepped back into the corridor. His face was composed, but his jaw was set in a way Father Valdivia had seen before. Not in anger exactly, but in the particular kind of resolve that comes when a man stops deliberating and begins deciding. They found Sister Josefina on the 2nd floor. She was in the common room, seated at a table with 2 other elderly nuns, all 3 of them with prayer books open, but not necessarily reading. She was a small woman with bright, exhausted eyes, white hair pulled back beneath her veil, hands folded on the table in the precise way of someone accustomed to waiting. When she looked up and saw the man in white standing in the doorway, she did not immediately react. She looked at him for several seconds, as though determining whether this was real. Then she pressed her hand over her mouth and closed her eyes. Leo walked to her table and sat down across from her. He did not stand over her. He sat down at her level, in a plain wooden chair, as though he had nowhere else to be. "I received your letter," he said. Sister Josephina opened her eyes. They were full of tears, but she was not a woman given to theatrical weeping. She blinked them back with the composure of someone who had been composing herself for 8 decades. "I was not sure it would arrive," she said. "It arrived." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "We are not ungrateful. I want you to understand that. These people, these priests, these sisters, they gave their lives, everything. And they are grateful. They are not bitter." A pause. "But they are very cold and very alone." It was the word alone that landed differently than the others. Leo absorbed it. He asked her to walk with him if she was able, and she was, carefully, with a cane, but steadily, with the pride of a woman who intended to walk until she could not. She showed him things. She showed him the chapel, small and beautiful and correctly maintained, the one place in the building that had not been allowed to fall. And he noted, without comment, that the chapel had fresh flowers while the residence corridor had a burnt-out votive candle. She showed him the kitchen, where the cook, a good-natured man named Beppe, who had been there for 11 years, explained with visible guilt that he was preparing meals for 63 people with a budget that had not been adjusted in 6 years, and that the heating system in the East Wing had been reported broken in November, and it was now March. November, March. Leo turned to Father Valdivia and said simply, "Write that down." He spent 3 hours in Casa Santangelo that morning. He did not make speeches, he did not pose for photographs. He sat with residents, held their hands, listened to stories about Congo and Peru and Argentina and Korea, the missions where these people had spent their youth, the parishes where they had buried the dead and baptized the newborn, and stood at bedsides at 3 o'clock in the morning when no one else would come. He listened to a 90-year-old Jesuit priest describe saying Mass for miners in Bolivia in the 1970s and thought, this man carried the church on his back for 50 years, and now he cannot get his dinner while it is still warm. By the time he left, Eleanor the nurse was no longer pale. She was crying, not from distress but from something harder to name. She had not expected to be thanked. Leo had thanked her and the cook and the 2 other nurses who had come in by then, had shaken each of their hands, looked them in the eye, and said with complete seriousness, "What you are doing here matters more than you know, more than you have been told." He said it as a fact, not as a consolation. By noon, 3 phone calls had been placed from the papal apartment. The first was to the prefect of the dicastery for clergy, Cardinal Edoardo Bertoni, a careful, experienced Roman who had navigated Vatican bureaucracy for 30 years and who answered his phone with the mild weariness of a man who had learned to recognise when the calm before a storm was ending. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. The Pope did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He told Bertoni that he had visited Casa Santangelo that morning, that the heating in the East Wing had been broken since November, that there were 3 nurses for 63 residents, that a former missionary to Congo had slept next to an uneaten dinner tray. He told him that he expected a full operational and financial audit of the facility within 30 days. He told him that in the interim he expected emergency measures, additional staff, the heating repaired within the week, the per-meal budget revised immediately. Bertoni said that these matters were ordinarily processed through. Leo interrupted him, not rudely, but with the quiet precision of someone cutting through rope. "I'm not asking how they are ordinarily processed. I'm telling you what will happen." There was a pause. "Of course, Holy Father." The second call was to the Vatican's administrative office regarding the budget allocation for church-run elderly care facilities across Rome, not just Casa Santangelo, but 7 others in the surrounding region. Leo asked for the figures for the last 5 years. He asked for comparisons with what had been spent on dioceses and offices in the same period. He asked that the comparison be presented to him in writing by Friday. He used the word written twice. He wanted the discomfort of seeing the numbers on paper to be inescapable. The third call was the shortest. It was to his own communications team. He told them he wanted to speak publicly on the subject of the Church's care for its elderly, not in a prepared address, not in a formal document, but in a direct statement. He said he would record it the following afternoon. He said he did not want it edited for tone. The statement was recorded on the afternoon of March 2nd, in a small room adjacent to the library of the Apostolic Palace. There was no podium, no arrangement of flags, no staging designed to project authority. Leo sat in a plain chair. There was a camera, an operator, and Father Valdivia standing to one side. That was all. He spoke for 16 minutes. What follows is not a transcript of those 16 minutes. It cannot be, because a transcript cannot carry the weight of what was heard in the pauses, or the quality of his stillness when he stopped mid-sentence. Not because he had lost his words, but because he was deciding whether to say the next ones. He began with the Old Testament, Leviticus 19:32. Rise in the presence of the aged, show respect for the elderly, and revere your God. He said that this verse was not a metaphor or a spiritual suggestion. It was a commandment. He said the church had built hospitals and schools and orphanages across 2,000 years of history, and that this was right and holy and good. And then he said, and this was where the stillness entered his voice, that somewhere in the long administrative history of those 2,000 years, the church had developed a subtle and dangerous habit of caring more for institutions than for the people inside them. We maintained the buildings, he said. We file the reports, we approve the budgets, and we tell ourselves that caring for the structure means we are caring for the people. It does not. A warm chapel and a broken heater in the room next to it are not the same thing. A balanced ledger and an uneaten dinner tray are not the same thing. He paused. I visited a home yesterday morning. I am not going to name it because naming it would make it about that home. And it is not about that home. What I saw there, I believe I would find in some form in many of the places we operate in the name of the church. I saw people who had given their entire lives, their youth, their health, their years, to the service of God and to the service of the poor. I saw them waiting for meals, waiting for warmth, waiting for someone to sit with them and ask how they were, not as a duty, but as one human being asking another. He looked at the camera. He had the eyes of someone who had learned long ago to say the exact thing he meant. I sat with a woman who wrote me a letter because she was afraid the truth would die with her if she did not. I sat with a priest who spent 30 years in Africa so that children he had never met before and would never see again could be baptized. He was sitting alone in a cold room. He asked me if I was the doctor. He stopped. He looked down for a moment. When he looked up, his eyes were full. He asked me if I was the doctor, he said again, and his voice had changed. It had become the voice of a man who is no longer speaking publicly, but cannot stop himself from speaking the truth. And I thought, this man is 91 years old, and he has given everything, and the church, our church, cannot keep his room warm. He pressed his fingers briefly to his mouth. His shoulders tightened and released. There was no performance in it. There was only a man sitting in a chair, feeling the full weight of a failure that did not belong to any one person, but that belonged, in some portion, to all of them. To every layer of administration and budget approval and policy writing that had gradually, imperceptibly, replaced the face of the person with the form filed about the person. When he continued, his voice was steady again. The steadiness of someone who has passed through the feeling rather than suppressed it. The church does not exist to maintain itself, he said. It exists to love. And love, real love, the kind that costs something, does not file a report and call it care. Love shows up, love sits down, love asks how you are sleeping and whether you are warm and whether you are afraid. Our elderly are not burdens to be managed. They are the memory of the church. They are the ones who carried us. And when we fail to carry them in return, we have failed at the most basic thing we were asked to do. He leaned forward slightly. I am asking the church, every diocese, every religious congregation, every Catholic institution that operates a care facility for its elderly, to look this week at those places, not at the reports, at the places, walk the corridors, sit with the residents, ask the nurses how many of them are covering how many people, find out when the heating was last repaired, find out when the last mass was celebrated. And if the answers make you uncomfortable, stay uncomfortable. Do not file the discomfort away. Let it change something. He spoke for several minutes more about specific directives he was issuing through the relevant dicasteries, about an emergency review he had ordered of Vatican-administered care facilities, and about a working group he intended to form that would include, for the first time, representatives from among the elderly residents themselves, people like Sister Josefina, whose clarity about the reality of their situation had more institutional value than a decade of bureaucratic self-assessment. He ended simply. He said, to every elderly priest, every elderly sister, every person who gave their life to this church and is now living in one of these houses, I see you, not as a category, not as a line in a budget. I see you, and I ask your forgiveness for every moment the church made you feel invisible. The recording ended. By the evening of March 2nd, portions of the statement were already circulating. The Vatican's media office had released a lightly edited version. Leo had reviewed it and removed 2 edits that he felt softened what he intended to be sharp, and the full 16 minutes were uploaded without further modification. By the morning of March 3rd, the statement had been viewed more than 4 million times. Headlines appeared in Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, English, French, German, Polish, and Tagalog. Several of them focused on the visible tears. A columnist in a Rome newspaper, not a Catholic publication, wrote that she had not expected to be moved by a papal address and that she had been wrong. A Catholic journalist in Chicago, the Pope's hometown, wrote simply, "He means it." Cardinal Bertoni's office confirmed that a maintenance crew had been sent to Casa Santangelo on the morning of March 2nd. The heating in the East Wing was restored by mid-afternoon. Additional nursing staff had been temporarily assigned from a diocesan pool. The budget revision was underway. Sister Josephina learned about the statement from Eleanor, who came to find her in the common room on the morning of March 3rd, with a tablet and tear-streaked mascara. The old nun watched the 16 minutes in silence. When it was over, she sat for a long time with her hands folded on the table in front of her, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the screen. Then she said, "He kept the important part. He didn't change it." Elena asked what she meant. Sister Josephina looked up. "The part about Father Lorenzo," she said. "He didn't change it to something easier. He kept it exactly as it was." She paused. "That is how you know someone means what they say." Father Lorenzo, when he was told that the Pope had visited him on the 1st of March and had spoken about him in a statement seen by millions of people, listened carefully to the account. He asked a few questions. He seemed satisfied with the answers. Then he said, with the unhurried serenity of a man whose sense of what matters had been refined by 91 years of paying close attention, "I thought he was the doctor, but he was kind. A kind man is good company, doctor or not." He picked up his rosary. Outside his window, the Rome sky was beginning to lighten toward the particular pale gold of a March afternoon, the kind that promises, without quite delivering, the warmth of spring. The heating was working. Dinner that evening arrived hot. It was a small thing. It was also everything. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who loves the church, or someone who has given their life to others and deserves to be seen. Subscribe to the channel, click the like button, and leave a comment below. Your support is what allows us to keep bringing these stories to the world.